The Maccabees were a family of Israelite priests who rose up around 200 BC to stand against the corrupt political and religious leaders of pagan influence. But their story is not just one of physical courage, but one of spiritual strength, loyalty to God's law, and refusal to compromise with the culture of their day. The Maccabees came from the priestly family of Mattathias, descendants of the Hasmonean line. Their name means the hammer because of how they struck down Israel's enemies. They had an unshakable zeal for the Torah, refusing to compromise with the pagan culture, viewing Hellenism as a direct threat to Israel's holiness. They became leaders of a righteous rebellion, and their defining victory came when they reclaimed Jerusalem and rededicated the temple to Yahweh, an act remembered in the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah. It was during that time when Antiochus IV, king of the Seleucid Empire, invaded Jerusalem. He outlawed the Torah, desecrated the temple, and forced the people to worship Greek gods. Many of the religious leaders of that time chose compromise. They blended Greek philosophy with God's word, embraced worldly customs, and betrayed the covenant. But the Maccabees refused. When they saw their fellow Israelites compromising their faith to save their lives, they tore their robes in grief. Mattathias cried out, "Even if all the nations obey the king, I, my sons, and my brothers will walk in the covenant of our fathers." The Greek and Roman influence during the time of the Maccabees was a cultural and spiritual attack against the God of Israel. Because they exalted human philosophy and entertainment above the fear of the Lord, many believers abandoned the commandments of God for the glamour of the gymnasium, the enjoyment of the theater, and political alliances which funded their organizations. Over time, the holiness of God's people was stripped away. Jerusalem adopted Greek customs, and obedience to God was mocked. What had once been a conservative, covenant-keeping culture became liberal, worldly, and profane. Friends, this is no different from what we see today, as the modern church has also traded God's word for wealth, pagan traditions, and acceptance from the world. Thankfully, the Maccabees opposed these changes with fierce loyalty to God's law. While others bowed to pressure, they clung to the commandments, refusing to dilute their faith with sinful pleasures. They saw compromise for what it truly was, treason against the living God. Likewise, today, true believers must resist the influence of worldly ideologies that corrupt the gospel, humanism that denies God's authority, false grace that excuses sin, and churches that embrace pagan traditions. The spirit of the Maccabees calls us back to holiness and allegiance to God's word alone. Their greatest victory came when Judah Maccabee and his brothers reclaimed the temple and rededicated it to the service of God. Out of this came the Feast of Dedication, or what we call Hanukkah, which John 10:22 tells us Yeshua himself observed. Friends, just as the temple was defiled and then restored, so we as believers are called to cleanse our hearts and dedicate our lives completely to God. The spirit of the Maccabees should be at the heart of every true Christian, standing firm when others compromise and fighting for holiness in a corrupt pagan culture. Their story reminds us that real faith is never passive. It's active, costly, and courageous. Friends, when it comes to our faith, the Maccabees are a wonderful example to follow. And if you're interested in these stories, please check out my other videos, including teachings on the Apocrypha. God bless.